July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. The center of the world was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, whether anyone else in the world realized it or not. Those days in that location set the stage for what would be the future of the United States, and thus the world. For 2 years the Civil War had dragged on, and for 2 years after Gettysburg it would continue. In total, 620,000 Americans would lose their lives. With the presidential election of a country gentleman from Illinois, the tall and slender anti-slavery candidate of the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln, the southern slave states began secession: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed a short time later by Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Rejecting the Union built upon the Constitution that gave too much power, they thought, to the federal government. These rebel states hearkened back to the Articles of Confederation that acknowledged the sovereignty of the states, and thus, on February 4th, 1861, the Confederate States of America were born. The North and the South were deeply divided on two paramount issues: states' rights and the expansion of the nation west. At the source of the argument was slavery. The South was for it and the North was against it. As well, the South wanted to be in control of its own destiny without a federal government dictating what its laws were. People in the North, on the other hand, were against slavery, and they knew that a strong central government was key to any nation's survival. With the election of a president that sided with the North on the issues, secession began. By 1836, the economy of the South was in ruins. The land was devastated by war, and money was being printed as fast as the bills came in. Having so much money in circulation made the Confederate dollar worthless. With the economy of the North booming, the land virtually untouched, and the morale of the Yankees in high spirits, General Lee thought the only answer was to take the war to them. The President of the Confederate States, Jefferson Davis, was in agreement, thinking a successful campaign north would cause backing from the European powers of England and France. On July 1st, 1863, the 75,000-man army of North Virginia under Lee found themselves near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There too was the 97,000-man Union Army of the Potomac, under the command of General George Meade. By the end of the last day of fighting on July 3rd, there were over 51,000 casualties, including about 8,000 dead. Some estimates put the trail of wounded at the end of Lee's retreat at 14 miles long. Historians call the Battle of Gettysburg the turning point of the Civil War, the beginning of the end. Whether it was or not is hard to dispute, because 1,000 miles south and west of there at Vicksburg, Mississippi, General Grant of the Union Army won a victory that secured the river and cut the Confederate States in two. Regardless, the defeat at Gettysburg ended the hopes of taking the war to Union land. Morale stayed high, industry went unaffected. Any hope of compromise was dashed, and the Confederacy lost all hope of formal recognition, which meant European intervention wasn't happening. 4 months later, on November 19, 1863, Abraham Lincoln went to Gettysburg to honor the dead and to dedicate the Soldiers' National Cemetery. The keynote speaker was Edward Everett, the most gifted orator of the day. After 2 hours of listening to Mr. Everett wowed the crowd with a passionate and moving speech, the tall and slender country gentleman from Illinois somberly rose to his feet to say a few words. Fourscore
and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, We cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.